All right, we're back for session 2 on Reconstruction. I hope you're getting the understanding of Reconstruction being the time where we're bringing bringing the Southern states back into the Union. And if you hear my kids in the background, they're out playing in the living room. So in my home office, trying to teach you guys and getting through this craziness, and hope you're doing well. So here we go. Let's get started. So life during Reconstruction. You can see here, looking at this picture, that not everyone had the same ideas or plans on how to bring the South back into the Union. And of course, there were many different thoughts and ideas on what should happen. You've got the Union soldier there in the middle, trying to keep the white Southerners from the black Southerners. And life was just not perfect, for sure. I guess life is never really perfect. But there were some problems and some issues and things they had to work out. So let's talk about what life was like for some of these people. All right, so some terms you need to know. Carpetbaggers and scalawags. How fun is that? Carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers are people that were from the north that come to the south to make money. Carpetbaggers, they got their name because if you look at this picture, it's they had these funny looking suitcases that look like a bag, like a carpet, like rolled up, and you like put stuff in it. And they throw over their back, and that's why they called them a carpetbagger. But they would travel from the north to the south to try to make money off the freedmen or off the white Southerners. And then you would have the scalawags. And the scalawags is a fun term, it's a fun name, say scalawag. Scalawags are Southerners who support the Union. And they were kind of looked down upon because even though the North won and they're supposed to be bringing them back into the Union and all this, a lot of Southerners were like, oh, scalawags, you don't support the Union, what's wrong with you? So there's definitely those negative stereotypes during the time period. And these were mostly focused on white people. You wouldn't really call a scalawag to somebody who was black. These were white people who were supporting the Union but lived in the South. So those are some of the people that lived down in the South or even moved to the South after the Civil War. Then we have the Freedmen's Bureau. So remember we talked about freedmen are the slaves that were set free after the war. So they were called freedmen, whether they mean men or women. It was just the term they used. The Freedmen's Bureau was really there. It was created by Congress. So those radical Republicans started the Freedmen's Bureau, and they started it to help the African Americans get things like housing and food and clothing and the things that they didn't need to do for themselves as slaves. So they needed to do it for themselves now. So that was what the Freedmen's Bureau was all about. And some of the ways that they helped, let's see, they helped former slaves with schools, getting jobs and housing. Remember, it's illegal for slaves to read and write. So almost all of them were not educated. And so, I'm hoping that one of the best ways to advance yourself and advance your prospects is to have an education, to be an educated person. So educating the freedmen was one of the top priorities. And also housing and jobs. They went from slaves to being freedmen almost overnight. So now they needed a job to support themselves. And what were they going to do? I mean, most of them were farmers. That's what they did, is they raised cotton for white landowners. So trying to find jobs in their skill set and everything so that they could provide for their families and stuff was really important. All right, elections. During this time period during Reconstruction, we see our first African Americans voted into office. Pretty amazing, right? You don't think about that, like thinking back in time, because we always talk about the civil rights movement and how the blacks couldn't vote and the whites tried to keep them from voting and all of this. But there was actually a period of about 10 to 15 years that blacks were encouraged to vote by those radical Republicans. And when they were encouraged to vote, they voted in African American men to Congress. We have our first African-American senator. His name is Hiram Revels. So that was pretty amazing. That's a picture of some of the senators and House of Representatives that were elected during that time period. So this was a positive time for African Americans. Now, after Reconstruction ends, we're going to talk more about the Ku Klux Klan later on, but they definitely were intimidated and pretty much made not to vote after Reconstruction ends. But during Reconstruction, we have our first African American leaders, which was pretty amazing, very positive thing for our country. Amendments. Okay, think back to 7th grade. Back. Remember, an amendment is changing the Constitution. All right, and it's very hard to change the Constitution. So these were not easy feats, but they actually got to pass 3 different Reconstruction amendments during this time period, about 15 years after the war, 10 to 15 years after the war. And they were very successful in what they did. And those amendments were, you actually studied this last year in 7th grade, so it shouldn't be completely new to you, but let's review. The 13th Amendment made slavery illegal across the United States. So now no one in any state can have slavery, whether it be the North or the South. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenships to all persons born in the United States. Remember that law of the blood and law of the soil? That's where this comes from, the 14th Amendment. Another thing that the 14th Amendment does that it doesn't say here on the screen is it also provides equality for people. And a lot of times when the government is not fair to a certain group of people, they cite the 14th Amendment because they think that everyone should be equal under the law. And the 14th Amendment guarantees that right. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, it guaranteed all free men the right to vote. This one is a little surprising because we talk for many, many years after Reconstruction ends, for about 100 years, African Americans were discouraged, and a lot of times their rights to vote were taken away by the Ku Klux Klan and by laws put in place in the South to try to prevent African Americans from voting. So the 15th Amendment guaranteed that right, but in real life, in practice, they weren't always able to vote. So that was there as a constitutional amendment, but in real life, not necessarily always true. All right, the Ku Klux Klan. I'll have a whole lesson on this later on because I think it's important for you to understand who they were and what they did. Pretty crazy the amount of problems we had with the KKK. So if you don't know the KKK, it stands for Ku Klux Klan. They were basically, when they started out, they were former Confederate soldiers, went around terrorizing Blacks, especially trying to prevent them from voting. But also just in general, they didn't want the Blacks integrating with the whites at all. They didn't want them to be in the same grocery stores. They didn't want them to be in the same schools. They didn't want them to be, near each other, same parts of town, any of that. So they were very good at intimidation and used a lot of scare tactics to try to keep African Americans from getting the equality that they deserved. But like I said, we'll talk more about them later. I'll also have a lesson on complete on sharecropping as well, but let me real brief tell you what it is. Okay, so you have all these plantations in the South. They're based off slave labor before the war. Now the war ends and we still have all the plantations and we still have all the slaves that are now freedmen. What do? So what the Southern white people decided was a good idea, was to rent pieces of their plantation, so maybe 40 acres, to African Americans. And the African Americans would then work that 40-acre plot and, cultivate their cotton, cultivate, whatever it is that their landowner wanted them to grow. The reason it was similar to slavery was because the African Americans were not educated. Many times the white owners of the property would change their terms and conditions of renting the land. They would often charge them a lot more money to rent any equipment that they needed to actually grow the cotton. and then they would pay them less for the cotton than what they should have. So it made the African Americans go into debt. And when they went into debt, they basically had to stay on that land. So they were technically free, they were freedmen, but they were tied to that piece of land because they were in debt to the landowner. And you couldn't just move up and move because the landowners talked to one another. So if you were in debt to one landowner, they're not going to let you, go to a county next to you and, rent land from that landowner, because they kind of had a network and talked to one another. So slaves were now free, but they were kind of tied to the same land, working under similar conditions that they were as slaves. So sharecropping is not a very good system, but that's what basically put in place after slavery ended, so that sharecroppers could take care of their families and such. Black codes. Black codes are laws. They were passed in the South, basically limiting any of the rights of blacks. You can see here, this is a railway car, and they started making, before we have Rosa Parks on the bus, sitting in the white section of the bus, we had train cars, and we had African-American train cars separate from white train cars. And so they started passing these laws basically stating that blacks and whites couldn't be together. And it continued, like I said earlier, for 100 years. It continued for a really long time. So black codes were not a positive thing, and it started that segregation between the whites and the blacks in the South. All right, I think we're done. Perfect. All right, so I hope you're doing well with these notes. If you have questions, send me a message, and I'll get started on our last video. Thanks.